Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into the world of Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, a real giant of the European
He
Renaissance.
really was a pivotal figure.
Yeah, and you might know him, but what's fascinating is just the sheer range of what he did. I mean, an activist, a thinker, obviously a huge letter writer, connecting with, the big names of the time.
hmm A polemicist, too, never shied away from a debate.
Right, and a self-promoter, maybe a bit, a satirist, definitely, plus translator, commentator, editor, just constantly stirring the pot in Renaissance culture.
Absolutely. And as you hinted, probably best known for his, well, let's say, groundbreaking and often very controversial work on the Christian New Testament.
Okay, but here's a key thing, isn't it? He wasn't really a philosopher like, say, Plato or Aristotle. Not in that systematic way.
No, not in the technical sense. He didn't set up a philosophical school or anything like that. And
Right.
actually, he wasn't much of a fan of the scholastic philosophers, that whole dominant medieval approach.
Okay, so no neat system to unpack there. But what's really interesting for us, I think, is how Erasmus sort of stretched the boundaries of what philosophy even was.
Exactly. He did that by proposing his own philosophy of Christ.
Which wasn't some, ivory tower academic thing.
Not at all. He saw it as a fundamental moral obligation. For all believers, a way of life.
Right. And that connects to his ethics of speech, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's all tied together.
Yeah.
This ethics of speech was his guide, really, towards what he saw as the true love of wisdom.
Okay, so in this deep dive, we're going to cover quite a bit. His life, his works, definitely his relationship with philosophy, humanism, Plato, that philosopher king idea, paradox, even Epicureanism later on.
And his whole concept of the word, which is central, plus his humanistic theology, that ethics of speech we mentioned, and then, well, the legacy. It got pretty messy, didn't it?
Yeah, censorship, scholarship, the whole deal. Okay, let's jump right into that relationship between Erasmus and philosophy. It seems like pinning him down has always been a bit tricky for historians.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's problematic. Craig Thompson, for example, argued he wasn't a philosopher in that strict technical sense.
Why was that?
Well, Thompson's view was that Erasmus pretty much ignored formal logic and metaphysics. He was almost entirely focused on moral philosophy.
Mm,
How should we live?
okay. And others agreed.
Well, someone like John Monfessani reminds us, look, Erasmus himself never claimed to be a philosopher. He wasn't trained like one of the universities, didn't write specific philosophical books in that style.
Right, even though he was obviously debating philosophical ideas, especially where they crossed over with theology.
Exactly. So if we can't just stick the label philosopher on him and be done with it, how do we get a handle on his connection to philosophy?
Good question.
The key, I think, is understanding him as a humanist first and foremost. His early work, Anti-Barbari, it wasn't actually published until much later, 1520, but he started it way back in the monastery.
Hmm.
It's basically a passionate defense of the Studia Humanitatis, classical languages, literature, against people he saw as barbarians for dismissing them.
Right, the sort of eloquence versus dullness debate.
Kind of, yeah. And a really central idea in Anti-Barbari, pretty radical for the time, was that classical culture was absolutely vital within a Christian society.
So not opposed to Christianity, but part of it.
Precisely. And that inherently broadens what philosophy could mean, right? Takes it beyond just a university subject.
How so?
Well, the dialogue argues that anything valuable in pagan culture, philosophy included, was actually intended by Christ to enrich Christian society. He even calls Christ the very father of philosophy.
Wow, that is bold. Redefining the source, basically.
Totally. So this philosophy of Christ, then, it wasn't like a set of dogmas or rules you had to learn.
More like a mindset? An ethical stance.
Exactly. A way of life, an ethical commitment. It crops up again and again. And speaking of influential early works, we have to talk about the Enchiridion Militis Christiani.
The Handbook of the Christian Soldier. 1503. That was really popular, wasn't it?
Hugely popular. He wrote it as a guide. Oratio Vivendi, a way of living for a friend at court who wanted to be more, Christ-like.
And it made waves because
Because it pushed back against the huge emphasis on monastic life and external ceremonies, rituals. Erasmus was all about inner conversion, a change of heart and mind.
which sounds a bit like themes that came up later in the Reformation, even though he stayed Catholic.
It definitely resonates, yeah. Though his path was different.
So philosophically, where did the Enchiridion stand?
It really pushed a philosophy of duality. Body versus soul, the literal word versus the inner spirit. And he explicitly modeled this on Plato.
Ah, Plato. not Aristotle, who was dominant in the universities then.
Right. Erasmus actually complained about Aristotle's dominance, saying philosophers had sort of sidelined Plato and Pythagoras. He even quotes St. Augustine approvingly, preferring Plato.
Why Plato? Seen as closer to Christian ideas.
Exactly. Plato's ideas about eternal forms, the soul, they seemed more compatible with Christian teaching. Plus, Plato's allegorical style felt, well, more suited for interpreting scripture than Aristotle's logic chopping, you might say.
Makes sense.
And the Enchiridion even uses Socrates' definition of philosophy from Plato's Phaedo philosophy as a meditation on death.
Preparing to separate the soul from the body.
Sort of, yeah. Gradually freeing ourselves from worldly, material things. This detachment from the mundus, the world, is what leads us to Christ.
Okay. And crucially,
This wasn't just for monks or priests. Erasmus insisted this philosophical path was for everyone. Philosophy is a spiritual state, not a job title.
that really does broaden the whole idea, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Plato, again, with the idea of the philosopher king.
Right.
How did Erasmus use that?
He used it in a couple of ways. Sometimes it was just high praise, a rhetorical flourish, like when he called Ferdinand, Charles V's brother, or King Sigismund of Poland, philosopher kings. Flattery, maybe, but highlighting wisdom.
Okay, standard practice for the time.
But he also used it more thoughtfully, to make people think about what philosophy is, especially in the Institutio Principis Christiani, the education of a Christian prince, 1516. For the young Prince Charles, the future Emperor Charles V.
Right, and the dedication letter mentions Plato directly.
It does. Straight up invokes Plato's line from the Republic about states only flourishing when philosophers rule or rulers philosophize.
But Erasmus puts his own spin on philosophy here, doesn't he?
Yes, and this is key. He says, look, I don't mean Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. I mean the kind of philosophy that frees the mind from errors, from vice, and shows you how to govern based on the model of God Eterni Numinis Exemplar, which, for Erasmus, is Christ.
So the philosopher king is basically a Christian prince guided by Christ's example.
Exactly. The new philosopher king is a disciple of Christ. He says it again in the main text. Philosophy means preferring truth to illusion. And then the punchline, idem esse philosophum et esse Christianum.
To be a philosopher is the same as being a Christian.
Pretty much sums up his practical take.
Okay. And the Paraclesis, you said that's maybe his most complete statement on this.
Yes, the preface to his 1516 Greek New Testament. It's a really passionate call for everyone to study Christian philosophy. He actually argues it's easier than getting bogged down in Aristotle.
Easier than Aristotle. I like the sound of that.
Right. He frames it as this straightforward path for anyone with genuine faith, not some exclusive club for experts.
And this is where he advocates for Bible translations, too.
Yes, controversially, into the vernacular, the everyday languages people spoke, so everyone could access Christ's message directly. Hugely important, that idea.
A real democratizing impulse. Okay, let's shift slightly. Paradox. Erasmus loved paradox, didn't he?
He really did. He often defined philosophy by it wasn't rejecting the argumentative, dogmatic approach he saw. He preferred something, well, less assertive. Using paradox, setting up opposing arguments to kind of neutralize extreme positions.
And the prime example is the praise of folly.
Encomium Moriae, 1511. His most famous go at extended paradox. You've even got that commentary, possibly dictated by Erasmus himself, adding layers.
Where Folly herself gives the speech praising folly.
Exactly. She invokes the old Greek sophists, known for tricky arguments, so right away you're thinking, can I trust this?
Yeah.
Especially when she's satirizing priests and scholars.
So it's satire delivered by an unreliable narrator. Clever.
Very. And then it pivots, almost sneakily, into this apparently serious discussion of Pauline spirituality, but still using the same style, the same proverbs.
So you're never quite sure where you stand.
That's the point. Erasmus called it a declamation, something to provoke debate, not lay down the law. The speaker is folly. You're meant to disagree, maybe feel a bit uncomfortable if you agree too much with the satire.
So it let him weigh in on hot topics without committing himself.
Pretty much. He could critique the church, scholars, politics, all under the cover of folly. Ingenious, really.
It still caused trouble, right, with the theologians.
Oh, absolutely. Even spoken by folly, the criticisms hit home. We see that in the letters between Erasmus and Martin Dorp from Louvain.
Dorp wrote to him basically saying, hey, the theologians are really mad about folly and they're worried about your New Testament project.
Exactly, September 1514. And Erasmus's reply, Epistle 337, it's just this brilliant summary of his whole critique of scholasticism.
It wasn't the main thrust.
He draws this sharp contrast between the recent scholastics tangled up in debates and logic and the ancient church fathers who were focused on the Bible. He accused the recenseurs, the newer guys, of neglecting Scripture because they were too busy arguing.
And the famous line,
What has Aristotle to do with Christ? Just cuts right through it. He basically accused them of idolatry, putting pagan authority over Christian truth. That revised letter, published with Folly from 1516, is a powerhouse critique of university theology.
amazing how he used satire for such serious intellectual combat. Now, something maybe less expected, his later interest in Epicureanism.
Yeah, it's interesting. He was never one to fully buy into any philosophical system, ancient or modern. But later in life, he did show some sympathy for Epicureanism.
Really? Epicurus, known for pleasure-seeking.
Well, not quite like that. It's crucial to get this right. He totally rejected the idea that the soul dies with the body. That was a non-starter.
So what attracted him?
It was the Epicurean ideal of peace of mind ataraxia, achieving tranquility by withdrawing a bit from worldly stress and cultivating a clear moral conscience.
Okay.
His final colloquy, the Epicurean from 1533, actually makes the startling claim that nobody deserves the name Epicurean more than Christ himself.
Christ an Epicurean. How did he figure that?
His argument was that Christ teaches followers how to get genuine tranquility, freedom from a guilty conscience. That, he says, matches the Epicurean ideal.
But different from Stoic apathy.
Oh, very different. He's careful about that. Stoic apathy is suppressing all emotion. He thought that was unchristian. In Ecclesiastes, he says a preacher needs to stir emotions, right? Not suppress them.
So Christian tranquility involves compassion, not just detachment.
Exactly. Compassion plus a clear conscience equals peace. It's a perhaps gentler view of Christianity than some of the stricter Protestant views emerging, which might be why Luther sometimes called him an Epicurean in the negative sense, like an atheist or just worldly.
Interesting. And you see a link maybe to Montaigne there.
Possibly, yeah. That
Yeah.
kind of mature, non-dogmatic engagement with Epicurean ideas. Another path Erasmus explored.
Always forging his own way. Okay, let's move to something absolutely central for him, the word.
Sermo, yes. For Erasmus, speech wasn't just, what makes us human. It was the key to the whole relationship between humans and God.
Right.
A massive theme for him.
And this connects to his famous translation choice in John 1.1.
The famous or infamous one. Translating the Greek logos as sermo, speech discourse, instead of the standard Vulgate Latin verbum, word.
Why sermo?
He justified it in his Second New Testament edition in 1519. His view was, look, the Bible text we have isn't divine dictation in every letter. Words are human tools. They mediate between us and the divine.
So the Bible is speech and needs to be understood using the tools of language.
Exactly. Grammar, rhetoric, context. The arts of speech are the only way we can approach the divine. Speech brings us closer to God.
This sounds like the heart of his humanistic theology. How did that develop?
Well, the exact starting point is a bit fuzzy. His encounter with John Colet in England was definitely important. But a huge catalyst was finding Lorenzo Villa's manuscript of annotations on the New Testament in 1504.
Valla, the Italian humanist.
The very same. His annotations had been finished 50 years earlier, but weren't widely known. Erasmus found them near Louvain and published the first edition in Paris in 1505, with a preface to Christopher Fisher.
And that preface was significant.
Very. Jacques Tomarat called it a paradoxical encomium praise of invective, because Valla had this reputation as a really harsh, bitter critic.
So Erasmus praised his harshness.
Kinda, yeah. He compared Valla to Zoilus, the ancient critic of Homer known for spiteful attacks. But Erasmus spins it positively, Valla as a heroic censor, cleaning up corruption.
Also.
Erasmus argued Valla had rescued classical Latin from scholastic barbarism through sharp criticism. Erasmus even published a summary of Valla's work later on.
And Valla's method with the New Testament.
He compared the Latin Vulgate Bible with the Greek original, and he suggested changes based on grammar, yes, but also on elegance, on good Latin style.
Which Erasmus picked up on.
Absolutely. Erasmus asks, rhetorically, isn't translation sacred or not? Basically a matter of grammar and rhetoric. He distinguishes the translator, who needs language skills, from the prophet, who needs the Holy Spirit.
Language skills are essential even for theology.
That's the core of humanistic theology for Erasmus. Since God's word comes through human language, theology needs language expertise, linguarum peritia. Valla's work was the model and the spark for Erasmus's own annotations, first published in 1516.
Did Erasmus acknowledge Valla much?
Well, Comerot shows he owed a huge debt, but wasn't always generous in acknowledging it. Often quite critical of Valla's choices, actually. Maybe a kind of tribute to Valla the critic.
And even the Sermo translation was anticipated by Valla.
Yes. Val had suggested it in his notes on John, and Erasmus's own annotations keep coming back to themes from that preface to Fisher, like the idea that the Bible, like all language, exists in history.
Can you give an example?
Komarov points to Erasmus's note on Acts 10.38, where Peter is preaching to Cornelius. Peter talks about Jesus being anointed. Erasmus writes this long note.
Okay.
He points out, well, the New Testament is in Greek, but did Peter speak Greek here? Or Hebrew? Or Aramaic, the local dialect?
Doesn't matter.
Erasmus thought so. If Peter spoke Greek as a second language, influenced by Aramaic, that could explain stylistic oddities in the text.
Ah, so the human element again.
Exactly. He goes on to say the apostles were only human, capable of mistakes or ignorance, which you can imagine didn't sit well with everyone.
But he presented these as suggestions, not dogma.
Always. He ends that note saying, I'm not the oracle, take my opinion or leave it. He told his critic Edward Lee the same thing. Escuchienda propono non sequenda. I propose ideas for examination, not things you have to follow blindly.
So both the text and the interpreter are fallible in this view.
That's the essence of humanistic theology. Very different.
Okay, so building on that, let's turn to his ethics of speech. Where does he lay that out most clearly?
Probably at the start of his paraphrase on the Gospel of John from 1523. He's speaking in John's voice and he acknowledges, look, God's nature is way beyond human understanding, beyond our words.
So humility before the divine.
Yes. And he argues it's better to believe in God through faith than try to grasp everything with human reason. Christian philosophy leans towards fideism, trust, not just speculation.
But we still need words, right?
We do. So we have to use names from things we know, even though nothing down here is truly like God. The Bible calls God, God, the supreme mind, and calls his son, his speech, sermo.
The Son as God's speech. How does that work?
The Son isn't identical to the Father, but resembles him perfectly. Just like, ideally, our speech is the true mirror of our mind, John's logos or sermo is the ultimate model for human speech.
Speech is a mirror of the mind.
Yes, and he finds human speech itself almost miraculous, how it comes from deep inside, travels through the air, enters the ear, and transfers the speaker's soul to the listener through this sort of hidden energy.
Hidden energy. Divine.
Not divine itself, he clarifies, but it shows how close the human and divine can be. Christ is called the Logos because God chose to reveal himself through him so we could be saved. Speech is the gateway to eternity.
That image, speech as a mirror, it comes up a lot for him, doesn't it?
It's everywhere. A guiding thread for his ethics, his religion. It's in Praise of Folly, the adages, his work, Lingua on the tongue.
Right.
He connects it to Socrates' speak that I may see thee. That pops up again in the Apophthegmata, his collection of sayings. The preface there even cites Plutarch saying words reveal the mind better than actions do.
So our words show our true selves.
That's the idea. And his final big work, Ecclesiastes, really develops this idea of speech as the true mirror, the image of the soul. And this is crucial. It's always a moral imperative, not just linguistics.
What do you mean?
According to this core idea, our society, our salvation, depend on our words matching our thoughts. Honesty. Integrity.
And he worried that wasn't happening.
Deeply. In Lingua 1525, he says the tongue gives us our greatest gifts, but also our worst harms. If speech is a mirror, it's often a distorted one.
A funhouse mirror.
Pretty much. He laments that Christ was called Logos and the truth, so we'd be ashamed to lie, but even Christians lie so much they don't even notice.
That sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? And his warning is stark. Once lying becomes acceptable, then we can no longer trust. And without trust, we lose all human society.
Wow. True speech as the absolute foundation.
Exactly. Break that and the whole thing collapses. It's striking how Montaigne later says almost the same thing in his essays on lying. Both saw their time as a crisis of truth and language.
So you could almost say Erasmus's whole life's work was about this ethics of speech.
I think that's a very fair assessment. It drove so much of what he wrote and did.
The powerful legacy. But, as we noted, a controversial one right from the moment he died in 1536.
Oh, yes. His enemies didn't suddenly forgive him, and his supporters could be just as fiery. One good way to track his legacy is just to look at how his works were published, the formation of his canon.
Did he plan for that himself?
He did, actually. As early as 1523, he wrote to Johann von Botzheim outlining a plan for a collected edition. 9 volumes, maybe a 10th.
Ambitious. What was the plan?
Okay, so Volume 1 was literary educational stuff, translations of Lucian, Euripides. Volume 2, the adages. 3, his letters. 4, Moral Philosophy, Folly, Christian Prince, Complaint of Peace, Plutarch Translations,
Right.
Volume 5, Religious Instruction, the Enchiridion, Psalm Commentaries, New Testament Prefaces, eventually Ecclesiastes. 6, the New Testament itself and his annotations. 7, the Paraphrases.
Getting very theological now.
Yep. Volume 8, his Apologies, all the defensive polemical writings. 9, his edition of St. Jerome's Letters, almost presented as his own work. And 10, maybe, a commentary on Romans.
Quite the plan. Did it happen like that?
He tweaked it a bit later, writing to Hector Boece in 1530. Switched to calling them ordings, or series rather than volumes, to fit in newer works.
What changed?
Moved the Paraphrases into Ordo 6 with the New Testament. Put his translations of Greek church fathers into Ordo 7. Broadened Ordo 9 to include other Latin fathers besides Jerome. Dropped the idea for Volume 10.
So when the big posthumous opera Omnia came out from Froben in Basel,
1538 to 1540. Yeah, the editors mostly followed his revised plan, though they did split the New Testament and Paraphrases back into Ordo 6 and 7. And the Latin Fathers volume didn't happen. The Apologies ended up in the final 9th Ordo.
and this structure basically stuck.
Pretty much. It's basically the same organization Jean Leclerc used for his big 10-volume edition in Leiden in the early 1700s, the one scholars call LB.
10 volumes.
Leclerc added a 10th just for all the Apologies. But he also added something else really telling.
What was that?
An Index Expurgatorius, a list of all the passages in Erasmus that the Spanish and Roman censors had flagged for removal, cross-referenced to the Basel edition page numbers.
Oof. That must show quite a bit about what they were worried about.
It really does. They were especially interested in his letters, his correspondence. Only Ordo 8, the translations of Greek fathers, seems to have escaped their notice entirely.
So the period between the Basel edition and Leclerc's LB edition was really dominated by censorship.
Largely, yes,
Yeah.
especially in Italy. The Counter-Reformation put a lot of effort into suppressing Erasmus's legacy there.
How did that work in practice?
Well, you had early local lists of banned books.
Right.
Then came the first official papal index of prohibited books in 1555. That listed several key Erasmus titles: the Annotations, Colloquies, Presa Folly, Enchiridion, Writings on Prayer.
Did that stop people reading him?
It stopped Italian printers publishing new editions, certainly. That index was suspended quickly, but then a much tougher one came in 1559.
Tough for how?
It listed Erasmus as a first-class heretic, all his works totally forbidden. That led to actual book burnings, particularly in Venice. A major blow.
Were things relaxed later?
A bit. The Tridentine Index of 1564, after the Council of Trent, eased the total ban. But it brought in stricter enforcement, leading to confiscations and destruction of Erasmus books already in shops.
So a mixed picture.
And it introduced something new: official expurgation, censoring specific works that weren't totally banned. This led to the infamous expurgated edition of the Adages.
The one published by Manuzio.
That's the one, commissioned by Trent, prepared by Paolo Manuzio, prefaced by his son Aldo, published in Florence 1575 with Pope Gregory III's okay. It was basically scrubbed clean of anything potentially offensive.
And of Erasmus himself.
So thoroughly that it's often cataloged just as Paolo Manuzio's Adages. They tried to erase him from his own work.
Incredible. But people outside Italy could still read the real thing.
Thankfully, yes. Imagine if Montaigne only had Manuzio's version. Would he even have invented the essay? Who knows?
Did they keep trying to expurgate everything?
The project kind of fizzled out. Later revisions of the index basically delegated expurgation to individual conscience. The papacy eventually just sort of accepted that some Erasmus would survive in private libraries in Italy.
A long battle. But after all that censorship, scholarship really took off.
It really did. The era after Leclerc's LB edition is one of growing scholarships, especially the 20th century. Huge strides were made.
Like what?
Well, P.S. Allen and his team's massive 12-volume edition of the complete letters, Opus Epistolarum, Oxford, 1906-1958, completely replaced the letters in the old Opera Omnia.
Wow.
Then you had Wallace Ferguson's Erasmi Opuscula in 1933, adding texts not in LB like the Life of Jerome. Hodjo Holborn's 1933 edition gave us key texts, including what's still the standard critical edition of the Enchiridion.
And the big critical edition project.
The ASD, yeah. Started in the Netherlands in 1969, still ongoing, a massive international effort to produce the definitive edition of everything.
And the English translations.
The CWE, Collected Works of Erasmus from University of Toronto Press, started in 1974, also still ongoing, making him accessible. Both projects are huge long-term commitments. Very Erasmian, you might say, festina lente. Make haste slowly.
Are there societies dedicated to him too?
Yes, the Erasmus of Rotterdam Society. They publish the journal Erasmus Studies, hold annual lectures celebrating his legacy. Their website, erasmussociety.org, is a good place to look for more.
It's amazing, isn't it? Despite all the controversy, the censorship, his influence just endures and keeps being explored.
It really does. A testament to the power of his ideas, I think.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really covered a lot. His unique philosophy of Christ, how he wrestled with classical ideas, that clever use of paradox.
And that profound focus on language, the ethics of speech, the sermo, and then the whole roller coaster of his legacy, the censorship, the scholarship.
It's quite a story, and maybe a final thought to leave folks with. Erasmus was obsessed with the ethics of speech in what he saw as an age of lies, a crisis of truth. So, thinking about that, how do his ideas land today in our own world with, challenges around information, communication, trust?
That's a really potent question. What responsibility do we have, maybe, to make sure our words build trust, reflect truth in our own time? Something to chew on.
Definitely something to think about. We really encourage everyone to explore Erasmus more, his writings, the scholarship. There's so much there. Thanks so much for joining us today on The Deep Dive.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel